Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, the Pentagon unveils its 2026 budget. Rolling out in an unconventional request, the nearly $1 trillion in total defense spending sought by the DoD comes with all kinds of changes to systems, equipment, and priorities. On the chopping block, the venerable A-10 Warthog and a number of Army land systems. What else is in the giant package? We convened a panel of our top reporters to dig into the numbers and see where the military is headed next as we get into the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon, here on Defense News Weekly.
Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Noah Robertson, Pentagon reporter for Defense News, coming to you today from our studio in Washington, D.C. We're here to talk about the Pentagon's budget this year and the unusual form that it's taking. This year, the DoD has asked for $848 billion in funding for fiscal year 2026. That's a decrease from last year's request when you account for inflation. But that's not all. The Pentagon is also counting on an additional $113 billion for next year in its budget, arriving in a separate party line bill under intense debate in Congress right now. That would bring the total to around $960 billion for the Pentagon alone and nearly $1 trillion for defense overall. At the time of the recording, we should say that bill has not yet passed the Senate, though it's under very close debate and could be heading toward a vote soon. To talk through what's actually in that budget request, I'm joined today by Defense News land warfare reporter Jen Judson, air warfare reporter Stephen Losey, and space and emerging technology reporter Courtney Albin. Welcome, everyone.
Yep. Thanks for having us.
All right, let's first set the stage for what we're talking about here. This budget request is very abnormal in a number of ways. The way it's rolling out, the timing, the ways it seeks to fund things, and then specifically, the way that it's funded across two bills rather than the one base bill that we usually get each year. Jen, what have you seen from your seat?
Well, as much as there are top-line numbers and some details rolling out with the budget documents that are posting online, this was a really unique rollout in the sense that there was barely one. We're really used to the Pentagon having a big day where they come out with all of their top-line numbers or overview documents. They have press briefings. That didn't happen this year. A lot of us just went off of documents that were posted online. So there are just as many unanswered questions, on the spending plans as there are answered ones, I would say. It's also just interesting in the sense that we don't have a lot of insight into what the future year's funding are as well. So it's been very hard to decipher where some of the services are headed. At least from my vantage point, the Army they released a memo in the beginning of May that signaled a lot of the things that they wanted to do in the FY26 budget, so there weren't a ton of surprises for me. But I don't think that was the case with some of the other services.
Can you express a little bit what that actually means in terms of the rollout and the numbers that we aren't seeing right now? What kind of uncertainty does that create?
Obviously, if we don't have the ability to ask questions about, how they're going to spend the money. For instance, we have the reconciliation bill that's layered on top of the base budget bill, the base budget request. And the reconciliation bill is supposedly can be spent over 10 years. The base budget is a 1-year amount. So, how you are planning to spend the money in FY26 as opposed to future years, none of that is available at this point to figure out. And so it's really hard to understand what this budget actually is and what will be accomplished in FY26.
Yeah, I would just add to that, just when you talk about the omission of future year funding, as reporters, that is a way that we track how a program is expected to grow, what kind of priority it has over the long term. And we also look at how that changes over time. Without that, it's hard to understand where certain projects are going. And in future years, it'll be hard to look back and say how that has changed over time.
Each of you covers a different part of the defense space. I'm wondering if we can kind of go piece by piece here. Steve, did you have any big takeaways from your bailiwick?
Yeah, one thing that is notable about this budget is that there's a lot of investment in future systems. A lot of key programs are would get big bumps up. The B-21 Raider, the Air Force's upcoming stealth bomber that is being built by Northrop Grumman, that would get about $10 billion in funding, significant increase over the previous or this year. The Sentinel, the nuclear missile that is getting ready to replace the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile, that would get $4.2 billion. And the F-47, the next generation fighter jet that President Trump announced to great fanfare in the Oval Office, that if the reconciliation bill happens, that could get about $3.5 billion in funding, which is more than $1 billion more than this year. So there's a lot of high-tech, crucial modernization programs that are being invested in heavily.
Though we should say, despite the F-47 investment, which is a major program for the Trump administration's DoD, the parallel program for the Navy, the FAXX, is almost all but defunded in this budget request if it actually were to come through and Congress were to appropriate it according to the levels that the DoD wants. They have about $74 million earmarked in that program in this upcoming budget request, and that would only be to finish the design, not actually to start producing the aircraft. So I think you're really seeing a split here in the way that they're focusing on the Air Force alone rather than a carrier-based fighter, as we saw with the F-35. Courtney, from your perspective, did you have anything there?
Yeah, I would just note from a high level, with reconciliation factored in, the Space Force is looking at around a $40 billion budget in FY26, which is small potatoes compared to the other services, but it's almost a 40% increase from what was enacted last year. Without reconciliation, the Space Force's budget is closer to about $26 billion, which cuts it about 8%. And that's notable for the service, which has kind of been pushing for some major increases to their funding, doubling or tripling of their top line in order to kind of maintain existing missions like satellite communications and GPS, but also grow in other areas like missile defense, counter space weapons, and then take on some newer missions. Reconciliation gets them kind of on a growth path, but not quite where they want to be right now. I also just want to note real quick too that the Space Force's role in Golden Dome seems to be significant. We've got Vice Chief of Space Operations General Gutlein leading that effort. We know that DoD plans to invest $25 billion in Golden Dome in FY26, but we don't know exactly where that falls at this point. There's not that level of specificity. We see plus ups in certain areas, but it's not necessarily tagged for that. We know they want to stand up a Golden Dome integration office, which will be interesting to see the makeup of that. But again, we just don't have that full breakdown yet to see where it's represented in the services budget or other agencies' budgets.
And Golden Dome is nowhere near going to be $25 billion too. That's just pennies on the fraction of what will actually go into the budget request, right?
For sure, yeah.
Jen.
So, at the highest level, the Army budget is flat. If you factor in inflation, it's less than flat, it's down. So the Army is attempting one of its biggest reorganizations in recent decades. It'll have to do that within the confines of this minimal budget increase in FY26. It's asking for $192 billion from the base budget. It's also banking on additional $5.4 billion in funding included as part of that separate $113 billion reconciliation bill. The Army enacted FY25 budget is $184.6 billion. So if the reconciliation, that's in FY25. So if the reconciliation bill passes and the Army gets $197.4 billion, that's a 7% increase over last year. But the Army wants to do a lot when it comes to modernizing the force. But there's questions about competing priorities and just really big bills coming due. The Army announced last month that it would be undertaking this massive transformation that includes consolidating major commands, making drastic force structure changes, canceling a wide variety of programs. We can dive into that a little later. Or billions have really already been spent to make way for priority efforts that are aimed at increasing overall lethality. But there are other things that the Army has to worry about, such as the primary role of securing the Southwest border, surging to an end strength of 454,000 active soldiers. The Army only received 20%, $4.4 billion of the overall $21.9 billion FY26 DoD operations and maintenance growth when factoring in that reconciliation money.
Let's take a break really quickly. When we come back, we'll talk about what is not in this budget, rather where we saw cuts or reductions in spending for fiscal year 2026. More on that when we return. Welcome back. We're talking about the Pentagon's fiscal year 2026 budget, the ups and the downs, the winners and the losers. Let's focus on that second part for a moment. What saw cuts and reductions this year? Steve, why don't you kick us off? What's happening in the Air Force? Are we getting rid of warthogs once and for all?
Looks that way, yeah. As part of the Air Force has a major aircraft reduction planned in the 2026 budget that would be the highest in the last couple of years. They're planning to cut 340 tails from their fleet this year. Now, the Air Force kind of signaled this was coming a few months ago. If you remember when Secretary Hegseth issued a memo telling services to find 8% of spending in their budget that wasn't needed and could be dialed back to be reinvested in modernization priorities, higher priorities. The Air Force responded to that by saying, we're going to accelerate the divestment of old and outdated airplanes. So that's why we're getting things like proposed divestment of the entire A-10 fleet, older F-15s, some F-16s, C-130s, things like that.
Right, and I think we should say too, this is only the Pentagon's request. This is not by any means the final Pentagon budget that we're going to get for FY 2026. And in all likelihood, Congress is going to start the year on a continuing resolution, as they do almost every year for the Defense Department, which means any of these plans going on right now are subject to change. And to your point, this is not the first time that we've seen the Pentagon try to cut some of these airframes that you're talking about here. I mean, this has been going on for years, right, with the warthogs.
Mm-hmm, that's right. And one other thing that's going to happen is that the Air Force wants to happen. The Air Force's budget proposes cutting the E-7 Wedgetail. This is the plane that was going to be a battle management plane that was going to replace the E-3 Sentry AWACS. The Air Force has been saying for years that the Wedgetail, which is made by Boeing, is a very crucial platform that they need. However, there's been a bit of a split between Air Force leaders and OSD. The Pentagon is seeing space-based assets as a way to get the job done instead of the E-7.
Mm-hmm. And we don't want to create unnecessary friction between our space and Air Force reporters, so hopefully we can continue on well here. But Courtney, add in what you saw there. What are the cuts?
Yeah, I'm trying real hard not to really push back on Steve on some of this, but no, I'll note here that the Air Force and Space Force have been talking for a few years now about what it looks like to move more of that mission, which is called Ground Moving Target Indicator, to satellites, to space-based sensors. And there is, with the cut to the E-7, there is a $1 billion add to the Space Force's budget for space-based GMTI. They've funded some prototypes and experimentation in the past, but this year it has its own funding line. We don't really know where that effort stands. We don't know a lot of details about how those, prototypes and experimentation have performed. But they've said that they plan to start fielding these systems in the early 2030s. So it's possible that their decision to cut the E-7 and pivot more sharply toward these space-based capabilities could mean they want to speed up that time frame. But we just don't know where that stands, I guess, at this point.
Jen, did you have anything to add there? You mentioned the transformation memo that the Army put out earlier. How do we see that showing up in the next budget request?
In a lot of ways. There's still a lot of details that need to come out about that. We haven't seen a lot of analysis on some of the decisions that were made in the memo, but the Army has been saying for at least a year now that they want to have more agile funding for a few specific areas, to inject new unmanned aircraft capability into the service, as well as more counter-UAS systems across units and echelons, as well as electronic warfare capability. They're asking for that agile funding, and this is all still up to Congress, but they're finally budgeting in agile funding buckets for counter-UAS, for UAS. They're $79 million in flexible funding to buy ready-to-field EW capability, $693 million for counter-UAS, $959 million for a variety of drones. In some cases, the Army plans to provide UAS, small UAS capability to 10 brigade combat teams, commercial off-the-shelf drones in the FY26 request, for instance. So hoping to kind of grow that across the force, and this would be a total of $1.7 billion there. They are also asking to invest $616 million to convert 5 infantry brigade combat teams to mobile BCTs. That's procuring infantry squad vehicles for 7 MBCTs, by loitering munitions, off-the-shelf drones for those units as well, and to grow new high-mobility artillery rocket system battalions and 3 batteries. So a lot of growth across those areas. Some of the, I would say, losers in this, there's about $4.9 billion that the Army wants to divest in what they call old equipment and requirements. And these surprisingly include divesting Paladin integrated management howitzers. We're not sure how many, if that's all of them or some of them, because we don't have the future years lines yet in the budget documents to tell us what that looks like. They're looking to divest legacy anti-tank missiles, Great Eagle unmanned aircraft systems, Humvees, Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. They're also going to, after just recently newly fielding the M10 Booker light tank, that's done. A new engine for Black Hawk and Apache helicopters, the improved turbine engine program, done. Future tactical UAS to replace Shadow UAS, also done. How they plan on filling those capability gaps remains to be seen. But those are some of the areas where we will see cuts. No surprise there, though. A lot of that was laid out in the memo that they put out a couple months ago now.
Let's pause there for a moment and take one more break. When we come back, our financial expert will give you tips on how to avoid scams. And later, what's next for this budget request? We'll look at the process going forward.
Welcome back. Are you headed out for a family vacation this summer? On this edition of Money Minute, Jeanette Mack from Navy Federal Credit Union is back to help you avoid scams aimed at people getting on the road for their summer break.
Studies show that just planning a vacation can lower stress, which is awesome. To keep the good feeling going, before you book, get the goods on avoiding fraud and vacation rental scams. Fraudsters are actively publishing fake listings, stealing real ads, and posing as rental agents. Some even offer properties that don't exist or have already been rented. Just remember the golden rule of financial fraud protection. If the deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. So don't rush your rental. Ask questions about the area to test how well the host knows the property. Check the address on Google Maps. Does it match the listing? If it's a hotel or resort, call the front desk to confirm. Search the rental company's name with words like scam or complaint to see what others are saying. Never pay with wire transfers, gift cards, or apps like Venmo. Use a credit card on the rental platform for added protection. Never share personal info like your social security number or bank account details. And if something feels off, trust your gut. Follow it and these tips to secure your vacay and your peace of mind.
To get more coverage of military and defense topics, power up the Nano drone and program it to overlook militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more headlines. And to be the most knowledgeable veteran at the reunion this year, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning to bring you the most recent headlines. And if social media is how you stay up to date, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. And for you new recruits, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. When we come back, more on the fiscal 2026 defense budget and how politics might come into play. Join us when we return.
And we're back with our defense team talking about the nearly $850 billion budget request for the Defense Department next year. We've been through some of the highlights, but at the end of the day, this is just a request. Now, as we all know, the military is totally free of politics and that there is nothing involved that would cloud this vaunted institution, but Congress, a body of politicians, after all, is not, and the president also plays a crucial role in the process. We had an unusual situation in June where Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was testifying before the House and the Senate, and we actually didn't have a budget request yet. And Jen, this created a lot of confusion for senators and members of the House as they were actually trying to ask questions about it. How do you anticipate that playing a role going forward?
Well, I think one of the frustrating aspects of this unique situation is, typically we have these service posture hearings with appropriators and authorizers after the budget request comes out. And so lawmakers can ask questions about specifics related to the budget, or express some of their opinions about what should be happening with the budget request or should not be happening with it. We didn't really get that. There was a lot of guessing, at least on the Army front, when the posture hearings were held. The lawmakers at least had a memo that the Army had put out signaling many of the changes that they wanted to make. So many of their questions related to that. There was, some pushback on some of the cuts, but I think generally lawmakers are in favor of the Army doing better to modernize. They've had a lot of failures on major programs in the past. They want to see the Army succeed. Obviously, it's to everyone's benefit to see the Army succeed here, but they do still want the Army to show the analysis and show their homework. And what we have so far with the budget request only gives us a little bit of that, what their plans are and why they're going about it this way.
Right, and I think that's going to create some confusion going forward as Congress has already started marking up its own bills. We have the Senate and the House who have each taken a look with doing their own homework before they got the budget request. And that's a highly unusual situation. We haven't really had that in quite a long time, if ever. And I'm wondering, Courtney, now that things are split between the two bills here, how do you think things will actually proceed forward in getting the Pentagon not only a stable line of funding, not to mention the chance of a CR next year, but actually getting that on time? I
don't know if anyone would realistically expect something to come on time. I think it's possible that as we see the reconciliation piece of this play out, that may provide some, near-term access to additional funding. But again, this is a little bit of uncharted territory, so we'll have to see how that plays out. I think in terms of, specific to the Space Force, we've seen a little bit in some of the, as you mentioned, the marks that have come out, support from Congress for a lot of what they're doing. We've already seen proposals for a slight bump in their budget. We know that Congress is largely on board with Golden Dome. And so in that area specifically, I think is maybe a little less contentious in terms of back and forth.
We should say, too, going forward, you have two bills this year, reconciliation. Also, there's the Pentagon base budget that creates close to $1 trillion for national defense. But what will happen in FY27 when the Pentagon introduces its budget request then? Will they mark it up to be close to $1 trillion, or will they no longer have this sort of reconciliation supplemental package that will get it to that number? And if they don't do that, how are they going to make way for all these priorities like shipbuilding, like Golden Dome, that will then have to make it into the defense budget? And what sort of orphans will they create while doing that? I think that's a good place to wrap for today. Jen, Steve, Courtney, that's all the time we have. Thank you for a great conversation and for helping us get a better sense of the uncertainty that we have going forward. If you would like more of our coverage on these and more topics, find all of our work on defensenews.com or any of our social media channels. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.